everyone, and thanks to our hosts for today. But thanks to all of you, because this is probably the first time you've been at an in-person event like me in the last year and a half. And it's a little bit different. I had to put totally different shoes on today than I've had on for a year and a half. So thank you very much, and thank you for the kind introduction, Scott. I'm here today to talk about how I think technology has enabled what I think is a brave new world post-pandemic. So let's think about, before March 2020, what we were all thinking about, what consumed us, what was in the newspapers, how we worked, and what we thought about as technology, AI, and cyber professionals. The headlines were dominated by things that seem like decades ago now. Australian bushfires, the famine in Yemen, Brexit. We're not talking about Brexit yet, again. We might be soon. The European migrant crisis and the Hong Kong protests. That coronavirus, COVID-19, wasn't on anyone's horizon. And if you think about what our work lives were like, we were commuting, often long times on trains. We were stuck on the motorways. We were in the offices. We were having business lunches. Remember business lunches? I have one of those today. And from a CIO perspective, for those of us in the technology profession, we were worried about slightly different things than we might be consumed with now. As CIOs, we were thinking about what Brigadier Crossfield talked about, legacy transformation, technical debt. There was very limited work from home. Everybody was in the offices. We were thinking about hybrid cloud, how to get everything working in a way that balanced our architecture to be able to deliver digital products. And then in March 2020, everything changed. And the focus became immediately, regardless of your industry, on how to preserve essential services. And when you think back to those immediate days post-pandemic, that was either March 13th if you were in North America, or I think it was the week after that in the UK, everybody was looking at their business continuity plans to see what it said in those scenarios about pandemics. And pretty much everybody was appalled that there was not a scenario in there that dealt with total loss of facilities. So regardless of what you were doing, you were faced with how do you keep business going when business doesn't exist where it existed in the past. And in the workers' compensation insurance company that I worked in, the big thing was what happens to all that claim information that's coming in? What happens to all of that medical information that people are sending us? What happens to those claims payments when we don't have a mailroom anymore? So how do you take that paper that's already in a supply chain for services and digitize those processes in flight? And then doing that when you have to get an entire workforce capable and securely enabled to work from home. So that required huge effort. And there was a kind of a unifying response to that. I know that the IT team that I worked with, kudos to them, spent 72 hours straight getting equipment provisioned to be able to get laptops and even desktops encrypted and sent out to people's homes. Getting the VPN set up, and at that stage, we didn't know what the threshold or capacity for a VPN was. We hadn't ever tested that beyond the handful of people that regularly did work from home. And we had planned to run a test that week in March of about 500 people, hoping that the VPN would hold up for that. And then suddenly we had almost 4,000 people trying to ping that at the same time. So luckily enough, we were provisioned. I had a great CISO, security officer, and team who had set that up and provisioned that in a way that was dynamic and scalable, so that we were able to make sure that people could get working from home and maintain that security across the network. But then making sure their machines were encrypted, getting the multi-factor authentication set up, shipping tokens to people, that provision of hardware became the dominant piece of work that we had to do for 72 hours. And like many organizations, at that point in time, the health system was stressed and was looking desperately for PPE and for help with nursing staff for things like, in Ontario, that was the telehealth, the telephone number that you phone to get nursing assistance. So the insurance company that I worked for were able to send 35 of our nurse practitioners to go and answer the phone for telehealth and equip them to be able to do that on their work machines. And we were able to send over 2,000 masks and gowns and gloves and pieces of PPE to a local hospital to do that. And that, I think, gave everybody a reason to be working 24 hours a day for those first few days. But it became a little bit different that next week when we were all on Zoom or Teams or Google Meets and getting used to the fact that that was going to be our future for we thought it was the next few weeks. But there was a great camaraderie in that, and I think a singularity of purpose, which was really helpful in those first days. And that kind of blitz mentality that I think took over. And if you look carefully here, you'll see on one of the pictures behind me, yes, one of the team managers did show up in Mexican wrestling masks on Zoom calls. So there was that humor and that camaraderie at the beginning. And that was the same regardless of where you were in the world, and it went from weeks to months. And I had the opportunity to move in the middle of a global pandemic across the Atlantic. It's probably not the best time to move, and I've probably done more PCR tests than I think anybody else in the world because I've been back and forward a couple of times. But it was remarkable, the change. The pictures here are of Pearson Airport in Toronto and of the BA flight that I was on to Heathrow. There were more aircrew on the flight than there were passengers. And that was certainly the case on every one of the flights I took. So international travel now still is significantly different than it was then. And when you think of all of us and the business travel that we did prior to pandemic, it's another very much a psychological change that we've all had to make to adjust to that. However, I came and I took on the role at the National Institute for Health Research. And the NIHR was funded in the mid-2000s. It's the nation's largest funder for health research, so clinical research and more broad medical research. And the intention was to improve the health and the wealth of the nation through research. So there's a big opportunity for UK PLC to be that research center for that industry across the world, and that's a big part of the work that we do. We're funded by the Department of Health and Social Care, and we support that applied health research nationally. So think about it, funding research, engaging participants in research, supporting the researchers, the nurses, the clinicians who conduct that, and investing in that clinical infrastructure, and partnering with charities, with other funders, and with the industry to get that done. So quite an exciting role. The National Coordinating Centre that I'm part of, the Clinical Research Network, actually has 5 local coordinating networks across England, and then the 4 devolved nations, Northern Ireland, Scotland, and the 3 devolved nations. We have research active clinicians across 30 therapy areas, and our vision is one of the research being an integral part of healthcare for all. In practical terms, what that means is the Clinical Research Network supports studies by funding research support posts in the NHS. So our researchers are the clinicians who are working in the front lines as well as doing that research in their clinical specialty areas. They are the experienced frontline staff that we support. And we provide the funding for the costs for using facilities like scanners and x-rays in the commissioning of that research. And we help identify and recruit patients and participants in health research so that researchers can be confident that they have the right people, they're completing the study on time and on target. So I think about it as that infrastructure from bench to bedside that's supporting the life sciences industry. And it's all there supporting that broad product life cycle associated with clinical research. So in the pre-COVID year, some of the statistics from the NIHR relate to the number of participants that took part in research. And almost 750,000 people in that year, 2019-20, took part in research across England. You think about that, that's about just over 2,000 people per day who are actively engaged in that. And the total number over the prior 5 years to that was over 3.5 million people. So phenomenal amount of people who were able to get interested in research. And that was pre-COVID. And then the pandemic happened. And what that did for the NIHR was to provide a real clarity of focus. The focus was entirely on urgent public health and on COVID. And that changed things. So when you think about our research portfolio being all of the different diseases, disease prevalence, life cycle factors, all of that became entirely focused on finding a vaccine, understanding how the virus worked, and thinking about therapeutics for that. There were 16 vaccine studies that were actively supported during the last year. Recruitment under those studies of more than 100,000 people, and a larger proportion than we have had in the past related to ethnic minority participation. And because of the nature of the disease, that's been really important for us. And the results have been outstanding. We have the AstraZeneca and the Novavax vaccines funded by NIHR and the work that was done from Oxford and AstraZeneca. We have treatment protocols, dexamethasone and remdesivir, to help people when they do have COVID, to make sure that that disease doesn't hurt them as much as it potentially could. And we understand more about things like transmissibility so that we can be helping the government when it's thinking about what the public policy needs to look like for the next few months. That's not to say they always listen effectively, but public policy is an art unto itself as well. So really, throughout the pandemic, those tremendous advances, and I think they were consistent from the perspective of medical research, but then whatever industry you were in, you were able to make huge advances towards digital services delivery. Technology facilitated an acceleration in decision-making that I have never seen in my career before, and I think that was partly that singularity of focus. With NIHR, that was certainly on the vaccines and the vaccine research, but whatever industry you were in, you had your own single thing that was motivating getting those decisions made quickly. And technology and the creation of digital services was helping that. It was showing the art of the possible, that these things could be delivered in days and weeks. It didn't take years. The procurement cycles didn't take 18 months. Things actually happened, and people moved out of the way to let those things happen. Access to funding became a little bit easier from the perspective of services delivery and digital product development. There was accelerated procurement, better relationships with vendors across a supply chain that was often interrupted. But as those relationships matured, there was opportunities to help get that supply chain shortened and to roll out agile delivery associated with that. And we had the business understand the importance of minimum viable products and getting those out the door. It didn't have to be perfect. It didn't have to be a waterfall mentality about here are all my requirements. Come back in a year and a half and show me everything that you've put together. So one of the big successes for us in terms of technology enablement over the last year has been the vaccine registry. And that's a platform where anyone, and I'm hoping you will go and have a look later on today, you can express an interest in volunteering for vaccine studies and share information about yourselves to aid study matching. And we have over 500,000 people over the course of the last half a year or so since the registry's been set up that have volunteered through that. It really helps because we can identify that cohort and divide it up by things like age or COVID-19 status, and then get those people matched up to the right research studies that are happening. There were multi-stakeholders and teams in that, as I'm sure you can imagine, involving NHS Digital and the NIHR. But that entire vaccine registry was scoped, designed, tested, developed, and it went from prototype to beta in 6 weeks. 6 weeks. It's possible. We need that singularity of focus and those critical relationships that were developed. So throughout the pandemic, doesn't matter if you're in healthcare or whatever industry you're in, there have been tremendous, impactful services and products being delivered. But what we're seeing now is things like increasing staff workload and burnout. People have been running hot, running hard for more than 18 months now, and it's starting to take a toll because as we're thinking about what's next, we're asking people to do more and think about more and reprioritize, and that is very psychologically and physiologically stressful. There are mental health challenges at every level in our organization that we've all had to be respectful of and attentive to. And that real exhaustion and the sense of where's the light at the end of the tunnel when people are dealing with personal things as they're working from home and their work and their home lives are both crashed together. Now, who would have thought in March 2020 there would actually be a thing called Zoom fatigue and it would be a real physiological and psychological thing? So where are we now? We've seen that tremendous success from the pandemic, from that singularity of focus, from that camaraderie and the idea of problem solving collectively to be able to achieve great things. And there's a desire to sustain that momentum. So all of our business leaders are looking to us as technology professionals to say, all of that great stuff that we did in 6 weeks there, make that happen for everything else that's part of the backlog now. But there's inconsistency. And there's uncertainty, and there are the business as usual demands and the backlog that the last 18 months hasn't been able to get at, as well as different new ambitions. And our staff and our boards and our senior management are asking things like, what is the future going to look like? What is hybrid work going to look like? Where am I going? And is work somewhere I go versus something I do? Because we shouldn't be making people go back to office spaces just to sit on video calls all day if they can do that effectively from home. And I think we've shown that they can do that effectively from home. So how can momentum be sustained when the backlog is so long? And how do you give people a break while still pushing forward, recognizing that all of that work still has to be done? And make sure that some of those old mentalities don't creep back into how we think about work. The idea of presentism, and unless you are somewhere where your manager is, then you're not being productive. So business as usual for the NIHR means supporting studies across the entire UK. And there are over 5,000 clinical studies every year that the network support. That's funding research for posts in the NHS, providing training to those folks, funding to meet the cost of using facilities, and then the identification and recruitment of patients. And if you think about that singularity of focus on urgent public health for the last 18 months, every other disease category has kind of stayed in the background. So all of those studies for cancer or for diabetes or for dementia have been waiting while all of the studies associated with the COVID vaccines and the COVID therapeutics have been taking place. So there's this huge backlog. How do you get all of those back on track again? Now we call that our managed recovery process, and that's getting those non-urgent public health and non-COVID studies back into the portfolio and supported. So it's a fairly big business as usual plus backlog portfolio that we have. And then new ambitions going forward. So how the network is defining what it wants to do for the next year and the next 3 years. And that's increasing research across all health settings, delivering right research to the right people in the right place. And when you think about things like disease prevalence, it's no use setting up a study at Imperial in London if you're studying cardiovascular disease and that disease prevalence has a center in Bradford, because you can't ask participants in that research to be moving between Bradford and London. So how do you do that matching effectively to make sure that research is done in the right place and transform the speed and the efficiency of the delivery to provide that notion of the UK as a global leader in life sciences so that people can engage in research opportunities wherever and whenever. So big ambitions, lots of business as usual, lots of backlog, technology as the heart of all of that. The work that we're doing is specific to creating that front end for patient engagement. Be part of research is that application through the web where you can, as a member of the public, go and look and see what's available, where you can get involved, and how you can share your information to be part of a study. Please do go and look at that. When I started work at the NIHR, that was one of the first things that I did, was to think about how can I be part of this and experience what that is? Because the more people that get involved in research, the better that research is, and the better that is for public health outcomes, for our general health outcomes, and for the economy of the nation. So we're using data to prioritize the most relevant research. I talked a little bit about disease prevalence and mapping that to where the research is taking part, looking at underserved communities and making sure that we're targeting research there as well, and using that real-time data to make those decisions. Future-proofing the research delivery systems, making sure that they're current and supported and properly integrated and interoperable, developing those APIs and the platforms that can allow those systems to collaborate and share data, and achieving agile and flexible delivery models to get things like virtual clinical trials supported. So technology is a very key component of the future, certainly for the NIHR. But you've got the expectations that you're managing business as usual. You've got new products and projects and development initiatives in flight. You're preparing for what's next. You're being bold for the future. And all of that while decision authority, governance, existing processes and prioritization criteria are all being reworked. So the challenge, I think, as technology professionals, when you're all in tech or cyber or AI, and there's probably some Mission Impossible music that I could be cueing here, the challenge, should you choose to accept it. I think it's providing that consistency and minimizing inconsistency in the process. Getting rid of uncertainty through predictability, thinking always about the customer and the outcome that that product's going to provide in terms of value to that customer. Removing friction from the processes. I think what we found during the pandemic was when we went to digitize processes, they were largely based on handling paper. So if you think about all of the workflow associated with things, it often involved, where does this get signed, where does this get filed, who does this get passed to? And reinventing those workflows to be digitally native really fundamentally changed things. So continually thinking and bringing that mindset to how that process needed to be lean and redeveloped, and removing friction. That gives the opportunity then for things like RPA and AI in the decision process. And when you think about how data can help with medical research, we can be bringing that data up front in the process for eligibility and feasibility for those research studies so that they're informed by what previous studies have been able to achieve and what we predict they'll be able to achieve before they even get into the process and find out later that there's perhaps a mismatch. So all of that is going to be clearly very important. Bring that predictability, ease of use, removing the friction, leveraging technology, and always going back to the how do we make things simple and straightforward, because there's an elegance in simplicity that then can kind of carry everything forward from that. Supporting and being an advocate on behalf of the business and helping the business define what that future needs to look like, because we are all empowered during the pandemic to do that and can carry that forward with us. So if I can just think of a couple of things to say about the brave new world post-pandemic, I think technology is at the heart of that. We truly understand how to make things work, how to accelerate those decision processes and enable that. And I think there's a recognition from the business that we've never had before that technology truly can provide that support. So I'll leave you with that and then just say, be resilient, think about your people, be kind. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Sam. Always nice to end on be kind, I think. A couple of quick questions. Thank you. What would be an effective way to combat misinformation regarding vaccines and the pandemic, in your opinion?
It's very difficult. I was listening to BBC coverage last night, and there was a clinician, a doctor, talking about the fact that now that vaccinations are going to be rolled out in schools, and the 12 to 15-year-old cohort is probably the most exposed to social media and online news versus regular news, that there's a real issue with being able to have them pay attention to real news versus fake news. And I think those are some of the key things that I'm a parent, some of you are probably parents. How can we influence our kids to be discerning about what they're listening to and what they're hearing because what they're hearing from influencers and what they're getting from YouTube isn't the same as the media that they're getting that is trusted and tested and sourced properly through like the BBC. So I think there's work that we all have to do as individuals. As a company, NIHR does have a communications department, as I'm sure you can imagine, that address some of the very specific miscommunications associated with some of the vaccine research. And that's always being responsive to that as it comes. But I think recognizing that there's a multiplicity of fake news out there, and we're bombarded with it every day, and being able to kind of tune that out and be discerning in that, and helping our kids with that too, because that's something that I think they really will need as we go forward.
Okay, and one final question. What do you think the long-term effects of the pandemic will be for other healthcare research that would have been top of the agenda prior to the pandemic, but has now naturally been pushed down in terms of priority?
So the managed research, the managed recovery program that I talked about is very much on how do we get all of that backlog back into the portfolio again. And much of that is based on, is the study ready to go now? Are all of those constituent pieces in place? Then let's get it on board and accelerate those processes. So there's a bit of a prioritization exercise that has to happen. Some of those studies are 18 months old. If the necessity for those has changed over the past 18 months, that has to be part of that assessment process. So it's very tricky because there is more in the backlog than can actually be actioned immediately. But it's that priority setting related to those as they are today versus as they may have been 18 months ago. So big challenge and lots to do, but a huge opportunity for technology, with the right data at the right time in the decision process to help affect those changes and to do that prioritization better sometimes than people can.
Okay, great. That's all we've got time for, I'm afraid. But thank you very much, Sam.
Thank you.